Hi, everyone. The webinar will be starting in a couple of minutes' time. We appreciate your patience as we are just waiting for a few more delegates to join us. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone, and I would like to thank you and welcome you all to today's live webcast. This webinar is part 2 of 3 sessions, Test House, with Microsoft and Comparix will be presenting to you this year. So far, we've shown you an overview of Coded UI for automation using Visual Studio last week, Thursday. So today's session will be on web performance testing using Visual Studio 2013. We will be presenting an overview of web performance testing. We will be looking at recording simple web tests, delving through to think times, data parameters, and rules. I am proud today to be joined by my colleague Peter Manwaring, who is a Visual Studio consultant for Test House. The presentation will last approximately 40 minutes, plus a few minutes Q&A at the end. Before I pass you over to my colleague Peter, please feel free to type in your individual questions on your Q&A pod now or during the presentation. We will answer most of your questions if time allows. A full screen option at the top of your screen is also available when Peter will run his demos this afternoon. So without further delay, I now pass you over to my colleague Peter.
Well, thank you, Mel, and hello, everyone, and welcome to Visual Studio Performance Testing webinar. I'm Peter Manwaring, and I'm a Visual Studio consultant. I've been with Test House for about 3 years now, and I've been involved in a number of performance testing projects for various clients. So just a quick look at the agenda. We're going to have a quick look at Test House, what we do and what we stand for. Then an introduction to web tests, what they can do for you, how to create, run and edit a web test at quite a fundamental level for this session, how to create a more accurate simulation to try and mimic how users behave on a real system. Getting a little bit more technical, we'll be talking about dynamic parameters, what they are and why they're important, and also discussing some rules as well, extraction rules and validation rules, to help you to tailor your test to make it do what you want to do and to make sure that the system is working properly. And as Mel mentioned, we'll finish with some Q&A. So here's some key facts about Test House quickly. We're founded in 2000. We've got headquarters in Docklands in London, UK. Although we have full service centres in the UK, UAE and India, so we can fully service those regions also. We've got good partnerships with major software vendors, HP, IBM and Microsoft. In fact, we are Go partners with Microsoft. And we also are quality partners to many leading organisations to help them manage their quality assurance. We're very interested in helping and training our employees to make sure that their career is also well moving forwards. Our vision is to try and be a global leader in software quality assurance, as we are a specialist software house in this area. And we also try to create new trends in the area, be inventive and find new ways forward. Okay, we're also very flexible and service-driven towards our clients, so we can always accommodate anything their clients might require. We've had several large organisations and several organisations of all sizes over the years. You can see here we've done some managed services, performance testing. That's our focus for today, of course, on some large corporations, also covering many different kind of business areas, from selling websites where people have to interact with it all the time, to banks and financial industry. So quite a lot of testing experience over a wide variety of different areas. Some of the technologies we are expert in, as I mentioned before, we're a Microsoft Go partner, but we also have many dealings with HP and IBM. We also have consultants who know about open source tools. So whatever tool you happen to favour in the open source world, we have some people who can give you advice and guidance on and how that works to give you how you get the best out of those tools. And all of those different software that plugs in and talks to those different software technologies, we know about those as well. So you can talk to us about them. So moving on to the topic of today's speech then is understanding web performance tests. And it's good just to have a minute or so just to concentrate on what they actually are, because it's important to understand from the beginning. A web performance test is really a simulation of a user's interaction with typically a website, which will then probably go on to be used in a load test. So you might have many simulated users all doing one or more web performance tests, and then you can use that to monitor how efficient your system is in dealing with the load that you happen to put on it. So it could be hundreds or maybe even thousands of users trying to use the system at the same time. To make those figures as accurate as possible, you need to make an accurate simulation, and there are several ways to go about that, which I'll be touching upon later in this talk. But that's basically what it is, so you can bear that in mind as we go along. It works at the HTTP layer. So what's happening is, as you run through to make a test, you make a recording against the website with the tool running in the background, and it records all of the web requests that go out from the client to the server, or the HTTP requests, and looks at all of the responses that come back. Okay, so it's important to remember that you're not actually recording the interactions on the interface as you were with the Coded UI, if you were with us last week. This is a different thing. It's just recording the messaging between the server and the client. It also records the timing data, so it records how long it takes you to do every interaction on the screen or generate each request, although you can go back and you can change that timing information, and we'll be looking at that a bit later as well. It doesn't run any client-side scripting. So if you've got any fancy JavaScript running in your browser to have a really nice user experience, that is not taken into consideration when you're doing a load test. That's not included because that's not what we're trying to test. You're trying to test the responsiveness of the server, not the efficiency of running scripts in a browser. So that's not taken into account. As I mentioned before, it's generally used for producing a load, again, on a load test, although that's not the subject of this talk, but we could cover that another time. And to do it, you use a simulator of a browser. So there's no actual browser running when you make these tests. A browser is too resource heavy if you're having loads and loads of users. So it's just a bare bones browser, but it does simulate certain aspects of a particular browser that you might choose. Some of the things that are captured or are not captured when you run your test. Things that are captured are query strings and form parameters, things that actually drive the website, things that the server needs to know to actually make a decision about what information to send back or what pages to send back. So that's very important. Obviously, that is captured. Also, hidden form fields are captured as well. So if that's included in the website, they are captured and can be looked at. Things that aren't rendered are things like images, cascading style sheets, as I mentioned, JavaScript, things like that, which are downloaded but not acted upon and rendered because, again, that's not testing the server response time, which is what we're interested in. And also, redirects are followed during the test run. So we have our first demo then, which is going to be how to record a basic web test, which is going to be your starting point for your performance and load testing. So if I just pull up my... Okay. So I will be providing the commentary here. So the first thing that we do when we try to set up a load test is to create a project, because any testing is now seen as projects within Visual Studio now. So I'll select Web Performance and Load Testing project, logically enough, and I'll give the name training to this particular project. And say OK to that. And it should set up in the solution training a project called training, which contains the files which are necessary to then just go ahead and create our web test. So there's an empty web test. It starts off by giving you an empty web test. To start recording, you have to press this button, okay, when you're ready. But there's a few buttons across the top there that allow you to edit the test. And I'll be looking at those a little bit later in more detail, so don't worry about those too much for the moment. But when you're ready to go ahead and make a test, then you hit the record button, and then it will actually make a recording and fill in the recording for you, as you'll see in a second. So you come up to this screen, and you have your web test recorder up in the left-hand side. There are several buttons. You've got a record button to start recording again. You can pause. You can stop the recording when you've finished. You can add a comment, which is always a very good thing to do, or you can clear all requests if you think that you have to start again for any reason, if you've made some kind of mistake. It's always good to make comments as you go along. It seems like quite a simple thing, but if you don't make comments as you go along, it's very difficult looking at the recording to work out exactly where you are inside the recording. So that'll be the first thing we do, just to say what it is you're going to do. So you can, every time you hit the button, it'll automatically pause. Then you can type in a comment to show where you are in your recording. And we're going to use the Tailspin Toys website, which is a Microsoft training website, as an example of how to record a test. So there's Tailspin Toys. And you can see here, it starts to build up a recording of the URL that we're going to, and also any messages, any requests that we send out, it will record. So another comment just to say exactly what we're going to do next. So we're going to go into a model aeroplanes area. Say OK, then hit the model aeroplanes button. The screen appears, and the recording builds up on the left-hand side, as you can see. So choose what we'll just do one more thing. We'll choose a particular plane, as a plane you might be interested in to buy, for example. So we'll click that, and then we're onto that page, and I think that's enough as an example. A real world would be more complex, of course. What the system's doing now, it automatically detects for dynamic parameters. It doesn't often find very many, to be honest. A dynamic parameter is something which changes from one session to another, okay? And it's important that you don't keep the same recorded value for those, because if you do, then your test might all crash because they change from one to the next. But you can see there you've got some string parameters, and they can be changed and parameterized, so you can take different routes and choose different things in your test. So we'll go back to the slides now. Thank you. And we'll talk about how you can run a web performance test when it's actually been recorded. Now, these web performance tests are going to be much more complicated than the little example you saw just there. And they can take some time to record, and they'll take a little bit of time to get running in a way that you're satisfied with. But once you have a test, you need to obviously be able to run it. When you do that, you have a screen which gives you quite a bit of information. It will tell you whether a certain request has been successful or whether there's been a problem with it, it's passed or failed. It will show you the timing, some timing information, how long it took that request to come back, how long it took for actually for the whole procedure to take place. You can take a look at a web browser. You can take a look at the HTML which has come back, and we'll be looking at that in more detail later. So there's some good things to look at when you actually run the test already, to give you an idea of how quick your system is. And we'll be looking at that in a bit more detail. So when you run the web tests, it's the requests that's been recorded during the recording, which then get replayed back to the server, and so the server responds as it would if it was a real user actually on a browser doing the interaction. But you can vary the information which is sent, so you can bring a data driving file, for example. If you're familiar with data driving techniques, you can use a data file and plug in data from the data file to alter the information that's being sent to the server, so you get different tests going on and different results. All the results are collected and be shown to you at the end of the test. That becomes particularly relevant if we move on to load testing, when there can be a great number of results, many numbers that can show you how quick or slow your website is under different levels of stress. Web tests can be run from the command line or from within the Visual Studio environment. But it's always a good idea that if you run a load test, okay, then you do it when people are present to look at the system, monitor the system while it's running. Then that way you get the best benefit out of it. And there's, as you've seen, or as you will see in the demonstration, you get a special page which gives you information about how your web test has performed and how successful it's been, which you'll see in this demo, which is running a web test. So we're looking at exactly the same web test, and now we're going to run it. So you can do a right click and you can say run test, and it will just go ahead and run that test. Or there's a button up there as another option. You can also debug the test as well. So that means you can single step through it. So if there's a problem with a particular request, you can run up to that point and really look at what's going on. So there's some debugging options there as well. So we can just run the test there as normal, and you can see it's gone quite quickly, and you can see that everything's passed. There's some ticks on the left-hand side there to show there's no problems. So you get, as well as the ticks that you can see, you also get the request that was made. You get the overall status and 200 means everything's fine in HTML. The total time, some timing information, the total number of bytes that were sent out. If you're doing some other kind of testing, then that figure becomes more important. You get also the size of your response bytes as well, how much information was sent back from the server to the test. So that's information you get on the top pane. On the bottom pane, you get a web browser. Now, as you can see, it's not a full web browser. Not everything gets rendered and not in the same format as you would see on a proper browser, but it's enough to give you an indication of what page you're on, what information might be there, what the user might be able to see, but you can't rely on it for a full user experience by any means. It's just there to give you an idea of what sort of where you've got to on the page, on the test. And you can see at the top, you can see you can read the comments. Load Tailspin Toys, click on Fourth Coffee Flyer. If those comments weren't there, it would be quite difficult to see exactly what point of the test each one of those requests referred to, because all it is URLs. There is a way you can change the names of those URLs to something a bit more meaningful, but those comments are really useful. So we can also look at the information around the request. So here we can see some technical information about the request that's gone out. If there's any cookies involved, any string parameters that's gone out. But more interesting and more useful, I think, is the response. What is it that you're getting back from the server? So you can see the header, also the HTML body, so the whole body of the HTML that's come back. You can also view it in a HTML text editor, so everything's nicely color-coded for you. So you can make sure that you're getting the correct HTML back from the server under these circumstances. There's ways you can automate tests, and we'll be looking at that a bit later. You've also got context. These are basically variables which the system creates during the test run. So there's some technical information there, like the agent ID. You can run tests on different agents and whatever the name is. The controller name, in this case it's a local test, so therefore it's just taken the local computer name as the controller name. But if it's a remote server, then it would insert that information for you. You can also create your own context variables, and you can create what's called extraction rules to get information from the returned HTML and put information from the HTML into your own context variables that you can then use in the test. It's a little bit more technical, but it's all useful. You also see these details, so you can see what is the overall status of that particular request. These two rules are put in for you automatically. You've got a response URL to make sure that the page you're seeing is what's expected, and you've also got a response time goal. So you can set a time limit on the page, and if it goes over that time limit, then it will give you an error and a warning to say this page is very slow. So that's an overview of how to run a web performance test and what you can see when you actually run the test. You see a lot more information if you put these web performance tests into a load test, then you get a very rich environment where you have lots of performance tests, performance results, lots of graphs. You can see exactly what your users were doing at any point in time. So if there's any kind of problem in the system at any particular point in time, you can see what users were doing, what tests the users were running. So you can help to pinpoint exactly what if there's a problem with your environment and where you can start trying to put things right. So editing web performance tests. Quite often, to make a really useful web performance test, you have to do a little bit of work on it. Firstly, to get it to run without any errors, okay, because of those dynamic parameters that I mentioned before. And also, you want your test to be as realistic as possible and also to be as useful as possible in as much as it will give you good diagnostics and good reporting. And to do that properly would take some customization. So some options that you've got for web performance tests. The run button you've seen. You can do extra recording. So you can actually add recording to the end of what you've got so far. You can add a data source and do data driving. We haven't got time to look at that today, but that's definitely a possibility. You can set credentials. If your server, for example, needs some credentials for you to gain access to it, you can set them here. You can create what's called plugins, which again we haven't got time to look at in any detail today. But basically, what this allows you to do is to write custom code, which will then override how the testing framework actually operates to run your web performance test. So you can override the way that it works, and you can add your own functionality either to the web, even to the test as a whole, or to individual requests. Okay, you need some programming skills to do this. It's a little bit technical, but just to bear in mind that's a possibility. You can generate code, so you can turn your recording into proper code, so you can go in there and look at it, and you can manipulate it that way. You can parameterize web servers. So if your test uses several web servers on let's say, a testing environment, and then you go and you want to do your testing on a intermediate environment, then rather than having to go through all the tests to change the server name, all you have to do is change one variable, and you can run your test on any environment that you need to. You can also promote dynamic parameters. You can run that that runs after recording, but you can rerun that at any time. But those dynamic parameters largely you have to deal with manually. Okay, and you can do something called set request details to make your test more readable. Okay, we can look at that a bit closer later on. So another demo will be editing web performance tests. Okay. So what we have here, we're going to do a little bit of modifications against this web test. So you've seen the run, okay. This is adding recording to the end of the web test you've got so far. What you can do also, though, if you right-click anywhere inside the test, you can add recording and insert recording anywhere inside the test you want to. Obviously, you have to be a bit careful if you decide to do that, because you have to make sure that the pages fit together nicely. Okay, so you have to test your test, if you see what I mean, to make sure it runs properly if you start doing that kind of thing. You can add a data source for your data driving. You can use a database or a CSV file or an XML file. Same kind of idea as the coded UI if you were here last time. You can set credentials. So if it's a test that needs credentials to run on a particular server, you can set them here, and it takes into account Windows authent credentials, and you can bind them to a data source. So that means you can actually change the credentials from one run to another within the same test, from one iteration to another within the same test. Here are your buttons for adding your plugins. Okay, you can either add a plugin for the whole test or a plugin for an individual request. So you can override the pre-request method, as it's an object-oriented system, or the post method. So you can write code before or after a request happens. You can generate code, so you can change this recording into code. So we'll do that right here, and it very quickly produces this C# code, which is another representation of the test that we've recorded. So you can see here that it says it's setting up a request to this particular URL. Here it's defining the think time for 10 seconds, and then it actually kicks off the request as a yield return. And it does the same thing with these other two URLs. And here we can see we've got some query string parameters as well, because we made some selections about what model aircraft we were interested in and what department we were interested in. So we can go in there and we can change those as we see fit, depending on exactly what kind of testing we need to do. So if you're a programmer, you can go in there and start looking at modifying your code that way. Parameterized web servers. the system will automatically go through the test and detect any server it needs to. So there's only one at this test. There may be many, of course, and you can instead of saying www.tailspintoys.com, then you can create a context parameter to hold that information. So all you have to do then is change the value of that parameter, and then you can you can run it on a different environment using a different server. So you can change the name of the context parameter name if you so wish. Say OK. And you can see down the bottom you've got a context parameter with the server name. And up the top you can see in double curly brackets, just under Load Tailspin Toys, you've got TS instead of the full tailspintoys.com. Right, so that just is an easy way to manage your servers that you're using during the test. That curly brackets is standard notation in this environment for doing a replacement with a variable. Promote dynamic parameters. Okay, this runs, as I say, at the end of every recording, but you can rerun it at any time, and it will do its best to try and pull out those dynamic parameters for you and promote them into variables which you can then change from one iteration to another to save your test from failing. But to be honest, most of those dynamic parameters you will have to deal with yourself. Here we can look at some request details. So there's our 3 requests. Now, a reporting name is a user-friendly name which you can define yourself. So instead of seeing a URL, you'll see your name, so it's easy to see where you are. Think time is how long the system will pause when it runs the test to have a realistic simulation. And on that screen there, you can change the values for any particular request. So when you were doing the recording, if you think you're a bit slow on the recording, then you can change the think time to make it quicker for a more realistic simulation, because that's what we're trying to achieve doing these web tests. And that's what we're going to talk about a bit now, the think times and how exactly you can manage them to try and get to that goal of creating an accurate simulation. The more accurate your simulation is at this stage, then if you go on to do load testing, the more accurate your figures will be when you load test your system, and then the better prepared you will be to give a good user experience at the end of the day. So some information about think times. How long does an individual user stay on a page? It may vary. Some users who are new to a system may spend a long time on a page trying to figure out what to do. Some experienced users may go through there very quickly if they know exactly where they want to go. So it's a value judgment, really, on exactly what kind of test you want to do. There is a way that you can do a variance on think times, so you can introduce a random element to your think times. But it's something you should think about quite carefully when you design your tests to get a good simulation. And when you do a playback, you can either take these think times into consideration, or you can just do a playback without the think times. So far, I've been doing playbacks without the think times, and I'll show you in a demonstration how you actually turn those think times on and how to manipulate them to so you can put the think times in to simulate good user behavior. So the way that you do change these think times is that you go into your recording, and you can look at the properties of each one of your requests. And there's quite a few properties you can see on the right-hand side there. There's a whole list of properties that each one of these requests has that you can look at and manipulate. And one of the ones is think time. So there is 0, so that means the system will go straight through. But you can type in any number there and in seconds, so you can type in like 10 seconds, and then the system will stay for 10 seconds before it moves on to the next request. And also reporting name is also there, a little bit higher, as you can see. So you can put in the reporting name there. And also quite near the top, you've got another one called expected response URL. So So you can type in there the URL of the page you expect to get back from this request, and the system will automatically check whether you're getting that page back or that URL back. Remember, it's just messages and responses we're looking at. So you can do some functional testing with this tool as well. It's not particularly designed for functional testing, but you can throw in some functional testing to make sure your navigation is what you expect it to be. So we'll do a demonstration. We'll be look at some think times. Right, so it's our recording again. Okay, so we look at a response, or request rather, look at the properties, and there's the list, and there's our think time. So I will put in another value there, let's say 7 seconds, because I reckon this kind of user will stay there for about that length of time. I can go on to another request and do exactly the same. Maybe it's a slightly more or less complicated screen, so people will linger there for a different amount of time. And the same with this one. So you get the idea of how you can manipulate these think times for each request to do exactly what you need it to do. So if we run the test now, we'll run it through, and it falls straight through without thinking about those think times. So 10 seconds seemed to be quite a long time, and obviously it didn't take that into account. You have to actually turn those think times on. Now to do that, there's this link up here called Run Test Settings. Okay, so for this particular session, that means this tab. Okay, then these test run settings will be effective. So you can change the run count that you've got, so 1 or 2, or how many of you need. You can change the browser type. Now, remember I said it's not a full browser, but there are some things there. And you can also turn on the think times. So to run the test again, you just click that link, and it will rerun the test. Now you can see it's thinking, because it's going through a think time. So it's counting down, and it's pausing at that point for that amount of time. And again, that was a 7-second think time. So it's pausing there, and it's counting down. If you loaded this up into a load test and you had hundreds of these users all going, then these think times would also be effective, and your 100 users would be taking this amount of time to do their work on these particular pages. And then you can run different tests with different think times to simulate different kinds of users on your system at different times of day, as an example. Also, I asked for 2 runs, if you remember. So it's also, you can see there, run 2. So it's also it's actually run the test 2 times. Now you can also put loops and things inside your web test. But it's important to realise that a web test that we're making here is a simulation of one user doing one interaction with a website. Okay, so you wouldn't, for example, try and use multiple runs of a web test to simulate multiple users on a system. Okay, that's not the idea. The idea of that loop idea is, say, if a user typically does more than one thing in one session, in one interaction, then you can use a loop. But if you want to simulate more than one user, you shouldn't use a loop. You should use more than one virtual user within a load test. Okay, we're not going to talk about load tests on this session, but just remember, don't use loops to simulate more than one user. That's not the thing to do. So thinking about dynamic parameters then, I'll just reiterate exactly what they are. They're important to deal with because they can make your system fail quite quickly if you don't deal with them. There are certain things within a website, certain bits of information that will vary from one session to another. A session ID is a good example. So a session ID might change from one interaction of the system to another. But since you've done a recording of a test, that kind of information is going to be static and constant within your test. So if you run the same test up for many users, all of those users are going to try and use the same session ID, okay, which your server might not like, and your server might return loads of errors, and your test will be no good. So what you have to do is you have to capture the session ID, which is sent down from the server at the start of each session. You have to find it, extract it from the HTML, right, and then re-inject it into your test at a later time where it reports the session ID. Okay, it sounds a bit complicated, but once you get the feel of it, once you get the idea of how to do that, it's not too bad. Often the most complicated thing is spotting them, but then actually dealing with them, using the techniques to deal with them is not too bad, usually. So there are things like hidden fields, HTML, a view state of a .NET. Cookies can make things more complicated if your system relies on cookies to send information forwards and backwards to the server. Post form parameters, things like that. All these things might cause your test problems, and you might have to deal with. And you deal with those dynamic parameters by using something called extraction rules. You use extraction rules to actually get the information out of the HTML that you need to actually to then be able to put it into a context parameter. Remember we saw context parameters earlier on, and then you get the information from that context parameter, and you can re-inject it back into your test where it's needed, using those double curly brackets that I pointed out earlier on in an earlier demonstration. You get several different kinds of extraction rules. Verification rules is another kind. You use them to get your parameters into context variables. There are many inbuilt types, the most common being a text extraction, which I'll demonstrate. But then you also have a lot of scope to define your own rules. So if there's something really complicated you need to extract, that's not so simple as just getting text out of a file, then you can do your own programming, and then you can introduce that as a rule. So if you can program it in C#, for example, then you can write that code and have it as an extraction rule. And these are your predefined types. So there's a lot here to do with HTML. You can get a tag out of HTML, extract an attribute value from HTML, look at the HTTP header, extract using a regular expression. Text is the most common one, the easiest one to handle, and that's the one that will be in the demonstration, which I'm going to run now. So we'll just start up Visual Studio, and we've got a slightly larger test going on here, but the principle is exactly the same. So to put an extraction rule against one of these one of these requests, you just right-click and say, give me an extraction rule. And here you have this screen where you can select exactly what kind of extraction rule you need. So here's one for looking at drop-down menus, for example, so I can get an option out of a drop-down menu using an extraction rule. I can find an inner tag of HTML very simply, just by, on the right-hand side, you can see as you look at your different kinds of extraction rules, there's different things for you to fill in that will enable the rule to go into the HTML to extract what you need. So it's just a question of filling in those forms. If you know your HTML and you know what you're looking for, you can fill in the form and it will actually get the information out and put it into a context variable for you. So there's one to look at the HTTP header, although it's usually the body of the response we're interested in, and extract text, which is a very straightforward one. And I'll be looking at that right now, but I won't be actually using this way of doing it to demonstrate it to you. You can see you specify a string that goes just before and a string that goes just after, and it does the extraction on that basis. You can also have an index, so if there's more than one example of those strings that you can find within the HTML, you can specify you want the first one or the second one or the third one using that index. You can even extract a random match. If you wanted a random example, then you can extract a random one. Also, sometimes HTML gets coded in certain ways. If you know that happens in your particular website, then you can set your HTML decode, and you make sure you've got good HTML, raw HTML, which you can then deal with. There's another way that you can get an extraction rule in. So you can do that first of all by running the test, and then you can actually look at the HTML that is returned. And then you can actually go into the HTML and you can specify exactly, yes, I want this piece of text or the text that sits within this position on the HTML. That's the important thing, because it's not the hard-coded text you're looking for, of course. It's the text that sits in a particular position in the HTML file. Okay, so we'll look at this particular response request and look at the response HTML. Okay, you can see that there's a view in HTML editor as well, in blue there. So you can look at it in the HTML editor, as I mentioned before. So let's say I'm interested in this particular piece of information that sits between the title tabs here in the HTML. I just highlight it, okay, and right-click, and an option within that menu is to add an extraction rule. And so the system will automatically come up with an extraction rule that will extract the text from that part of the HTML. It says here that it's going to put the extracted text into a parameter called param0, okay, and obviously it will increment as we go along. But you can change the parameter name to something more meaningful to you. So there's an extraction rule that it's put in automatically. We look at the properties of that rule on the right-hand side, and you can see that it's got the param0 as its name. You can change it here to something that means something to you. There's the text that it ends with, or rather the text that's just immediately at the right-hand side of the text you're looking for. There's the text which is immediately at the left-hand side of the text you're looking for. Defaults to 5 characters. I recommend that you extend that and you do more than 5 characters, just to make sure that you don't get any false returns. Just by chance, it might pick up the wrong thing. So it's always a good idea to extend and make it more precise in what it's looking for. So we'll run it again and we'll see how that extraction rule has worked for us. If we now look at the context, you go to the bottom of the bottom, look at the context, you see param0, and there's the text that we asked it to extract, home, Tailspin Toys. Now that's useful because if that was a dynamic piece of data, if that was something like a session variable, then with every time this test runs, that would be different. But we would have that particular piece of data for that particular run in a variable. Okay. Now we can use that variable to plug in that value later on in the test, where it's used, to go back to the server to say, yes, this is the correct session for this particular user, for this particular session. So we'll just change it to a more meaningful name, call it title. And let's say, for example, I'm not interested in the first occurrence of that particular match. It's 0 base, so if I, say, put a 1 there, I actually go for the second occurrence. I think there's more than one occurrence of that particular string within the HTML response. So it should find something, just as an illustration of the concept. It may not be exactly the same. Let's take a look at the context. And you can see, yes, it's changed the title and it's found something, not exactly what it had before, but it's found the second occurrence of that string. And it's reported back whatever was inside the beginning and end string, and put that inside the variable. So that's how extraction rules work. Very important for dealing with those dynamic variables, and also for any other application you can think of within your test. They're very useful things. Validation rules, well, similar idea to extraction rules, but this time you're checking that there's something in the HTML which you're expecting to get back from the server, and you can check whether it's there or not. Quite some similar kind of options out of the box. Different kinds of validation rules, again to do with HTML, like the inner tag and a form field. You can also do a fine text. You've also got something. You can also do a validation rule on return HTML, as I said, or on response time, so you can make sure that your page is rendered within a certain amount of time. You can do validation rules against individual requests, or you can do global rules which will apply to every request within a certain test. So you can, if for example you expect to see a piece of text or a logo on the screen for every screen that you visit, you can write one rule, make it a global rule, and it will test every request, every response. So it has this particular string or logo, for example, on every page. So that concludes the demonstrations and the presentation for this evening's topic. Just a few words about what else Test House may offer. We do help with deployment as well. So if you're new to Visual Studio, for example, and you need some help with installation or customization or integration with other bits of software that you may use, like SharePoint, for example. We have experts in that area who can certainly help you. We do consultancy. There's a scheme called DTDPS, which stands for Developer Tools Deployment Planning Services. And how that basically works is that if you buy licenses from Microsoft for buying Microsoft products, then you get points for that, which you can then trade for free consultancy days, where partners such as ourselves can come along and give you, for example, some training or a little bit of consultancy, and also do an investigation into the way that you're using the software to make sure that you're getting the best out of it. And that, as I say, if you buy licenses, then you may have these points. So if you need to know whether you have these points or not, you can contact us and we can find out for you whether you're eligible for this scheme. We also have some quite extensive training program, which we can do on-site, on your premises, or here at our premises, or in a more sort of two-way interaction over the internet, more interactive than been happening here, of course. And we cover topics like test automation using Coded UI. There's much more than Web and Load can do for you than we've had time to show you here, so we do full courses for those technologies. Also, manual testing with Microsoft Test Manager. We also can do more general training for your ALM and how testing can fit into your Scrum, for example, and how to organize and run your projects to get good quality. So contact us if you're interested in any of those training options. We're also on social media. So you can see videos on YouTube with demonstrations about different testing technologies. We have a Twitter feed. Okay, we're in Pinpoint. Okay, so you can find us there. And also we have we're on LinkedIn as well. Okay, so you can find us in many places on social media. Right, so as I say, that's the end of the presentation. So I'll now hand over to Melanie for some Q&A.
Thank you so much, Peter. I hope you guys, thank you for staying that long. I know we've overrun for a few minutes. So we'll quickly do a Q&A session, take a few questions in, and then maybe if you have any further questions, we'll take those offline. So please feel free to type in your questions, as I mentioned earlier, on your Q&A pod. So I know for a fact that we have a few questions whilst Peter was doing his presentation, so we'll make a start on the questions. First question, what protocol can we test with web performance test?
Well, as you've seen in the demonstrations, it's mostly used for websites, so that would cover HTTP and HTTPS. But as you've seen, it's very extendable, the system, and you can write your own custom code that can plug into the framework that overrides the way that the framework operates. So you can actually write your own code to interface with other kinds of system. For example, we quite recently did some load testing on an email system, and for that we had to do some load testing against an SMTP environment. So we did some coding, and we wrote some plugins to test against load test that kind of system. So yeah, out of the box, it's usually website kind of technology, but with a bit of programming, you can make it fit most things.
Next question. Can you simulate multiple users in a web test?
Well, in a web test, that's not really what it's designed for. You can run the same test multiple times. I didn't have time to show you about loops within a web test, but you can write loops and conditionals and things like that. But you've got to remember that a web test is an interaction of one user using a website for one transaction. Okay, log in, do something, log out, that kind of thing. If you want to have lots of users logging in together and using your system all together, then what you would do is you would take your web test or several web tests that you developed, and you can put them together into what's called a load test, where you define the mixture of what tests you want to use, percentage-wise, and lots of other options as well, which you can use, like what mix of browsers, mix of networking technologies. Then you define how many users you want to have at any particular time, and you just set it going. And you can increase the number of users, and the system will then automatically generate virtual users using the web tests or running the web tests that you've developed. Okay, and then you can get information on how your system is performing, how long it takes the different pages to load up and to be viewed, as well as things like how long it takes your database to actually do its processing, that kind of thing. So if you want to do load testing with multiple users, then there's another step to do and actually take it into a load test.
We'll take two more questions, and then we'll take some of the questions offline. Can you get more specific timing data from different parts of the test?
Yeah, in the demonstrations, as you've seen, every request has its own timing information that comes back. So you can see how each request has performed. But you can build into the web test things called transactions, where you can lump together a series of these requests, and then the system, as far as timing is concerned, will treat that as one block or one entity, and it will return timing information for that particular transaction as you've defined. Okay, and then if you run a load test, you can get reports on those transactions. So if you have a critical part of the web interaction which you want to keep a very close watch on, then you can turn that into a transaction within a web test, and you can get reporting on that specific period of the interaction.
And then we'll take the last question. Our application is quite complex, and the extraction and validation rules you presented are not very advanced. How can we solve this?
Yes, well, for brevity, really, I took some simple examples for an extraction rule, just a simple text extraction. But as I've said, you can write your own extraction rules using C#, for example. So if you know how to actually do something in C#, and you have and within the C# you would have access to all the HTML as well as other information about the test. So you could write C# codes to extract and manipulate things within the HTML. And then maybe you could do extra reporting, write things to a file. You can do things with web services like JSON, for example, or SOAP. So if you understand how those things work and they're in your environment, you can write plugins to deal with those technologies. So the whole system is very extendable and very flexible.
Thank you, Peter. And that concludes our Q&A session. The recording, before we go, the recording will be available in the next couple of days. I would say latest Monday or Tuesday of next week. If you do have any further technical questions you would like to ask Peter, please do email him. His contact details are on your screen as we speak. Once again, as Peter mentioned, if you want to know more about our DT-DPS, or if you want to find out how many DT-DPS entitlements, which is a free Microsoft Consulting Days your company has, please feel free to contact me. My details are also on your screen right now. We will hopefully see you next year for our last session. It is scheduled on Wednesday, the 14th of Jan, where we will be presenting Microsoft Test Manager, or MTM. So thank you all very much for joining us this afternoon. Have a wonderful Christmas and a fantastic New Year.